morning.
Good morning.
So I have a bit of a cold, so please bear with me. It's also my first time giving a talk here, so I might be a little nervous. So what I'd like to talk about today is Kōdō Sawaki, so that is most of our Dharma great-grandfather, or Hojo-san's Dharma grandfather, about his engagement with Indian philosophy called Yogacara. Hojo-san talked a little bit about Yogācāra last time, so I think I'd start by just introducing some of the concepts of Yogācāra. Again, we went over some of them last time, but and it's sort of one of two main philosophical schools in India. The other one is the Madhyamaka school, which is sort of pretty well represented by the Heart Sutra, which we chant in the morning. And the basic idea of that philosophical school is that everything lacks an enduring essence. So in early Buddhism, the idea was more that just the individual lacks a self. That's called anatman. But it didn't necessarily extend to other things, so objects out in the world, for example. So what the Madhyamaka school did was take that a step further and say it's not just this being that lacks a self, it's actually every single thing in the universe. Yogacara does something a little different. It won't negate the idea of an essence, but what it does is actually negate the idea of a sort of physical external world. So maybe the best way to show this are with the what are called the 18 elements. So these are the I, etc., down to the mind. So eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind. And then things that we see, so sight, down to objects of mind. So this would be things that we hear, things that we taste, things that we touch, and so on. And then the contact between these two things produces in our mind what is called eye consciousness. So we are aware of a visible world. So that's eye consciousness. And then that goes all the way to mind consciousness. And in the Heart Sutra, these are all, negated. You go through all of these and say no, no eye, no ears, no tongue, no body, no mind, etc. And you go through this whole list of 18. So these are the sense organs, the sense objects, and the sense consciousnesses. So this is sort of a standard Buddhist view of the world. What Yogacara does is it takes these 10, so the eye and the thing that the eye sees, the nose and the thing that the nose smells, and so forth, and says that these actually don't exist. All that exists is eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, etc. And we have a mind, but it's immaterial. This is not seen as like a physical mind, like a brain. So for ancient Indians, they didn't kind of tie the thinking process to the brain like we do today. So for Yogacara then, this becomes called what's called Vijñaptimātratā, which is sometimes translated as consciousness only, but scholars nowadays seem to prefer manifestation only as sort of a better translation. So the idea basically is that the only thing that really exists is the world as manifests itself in our minds. That's the only existent thing. So there actually are no physical objects out in the world. And the reason that they want to do this is because it collapses duality. So if we accept this viewpoint, there can be no self and other. There's only the manifestation of reality. So in the same way that the Madhyamaka school will say that perceiving things as having an enduring essence, so like this is, this has penness somehow, and then we attach to that, and then when it breaks we get upset because it's no longer manifesting that penness that I thought it should have. What Yogacara does instead is basically, so for Madhyamaka that would be sort of the cause of suffering is positing this essence, but then it's not actually there, and we get upset about that. So for Yogācāra, instead, the fundamental source of ignorance is perceiving the things out in the world to be separate from the manifestation of our brain, basically. So they have two different approaches in this regard. Another thing that Yogācāra does is it adds two additional consciousnesses. So Hojo-san, I think, mentioned this last time. So in addition to the 6 consciousnesses that we have here, they add a defiled consciousness, which is called a klishta manas, and a storehouse consciousness, which is aleya vijñāna. Basically, the defiled consciousness is what perceives a self, an enduring, independent self. And it does that by looking at the storehouse consciousness and perceiving it to be this permanent thing. The storehouse consciousness is sort of described as a repository of seeds of experience of past karma. So it's often compared to like the subconscious in Western terms. So basically each of these seeds represents some past experience that gets laid down in the storehouse consciousness, and then at some point in the future it will ripen into experience that we mistake for something outside of ourselves, but really again it's just part of this single one-dimensional manifestation of reality. I should add, please interrupt me at any point if any of this is like sounding crazy, because I know it's a little weird. So if anyone's confused, please let me know.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Could you write the name of the Indian philosophy that you were contrasting to Yogācāra?
Yeah.
Not in...
So it's the middle way school, or Madhyamaka. And it's represented by the Prajñaparamita texts, so like the Heart Sutra, for example. Let's see if I have it written down somewhere so I can spell it correctly. Well, I don't want to waste time doing that, so I have a lot to do, but I think I can. I think it's AKA, Madhyamaka, or middle way.
Okay, thank you.
And that's, sorry?
We're in the realm of Buddhism for this whole discussion. Is that accurate?
Yes, so Yogācāra developed in the 4th century in India, so a little bit after the Middle Way school.
Okay.
And its main proponents were 2 philosophers. One is Asanga, who Hojo-san was quoting from last week, and the other is Vasubandhu, who is supposedly in our lineage, actually. So if you look at our lineage chart, he's one of the people back in India. Whether there's any historical accuracy to that is highly doubtful, but he's there nonetheless. So at any rate. And then last week, Hojo-san talked about the 3 natures, which I'll talk about a little bit more as we get into this. So any other questions so far on this stuff? All right, so let's get into Kōdō Sawaki then. So when Kōdō Sawaki was, let's see, so 1908, he was born in 1880. So when he was 28, he went to a Yogacara seminary, basically, in Japan, at a temple called Horyuji, which is a pretty famous temple in Nara. I think, right? Is it in Nara? Yeah. And in Japan, this school is called Hosso, which means something like Dharma characteristics. That's what they call the Yogacara school there. And he ended up here in sort of a funny way. So he didn't intend really to study Yogacara philosophy. When he was 19 years old, this was, I think, 2 years after he had been ordained as a priest, he practiced with a teacher who recommended that he study some sort of like general Buddhism before he jumped into Dogen. Sawaki was from a very poor background, so he didn't have any money to pay for sort of the typical seminary where someone might go normally. So he started by going to a Pure Land temple in his hometown to study. But shortly after arriving there, someone came through and said, hey, there's this temple, Horyuji, where they'll let you pay, or let you study without paying. And they have a really great abbot. His name is Join Saiki. So Sawaki decided to take him up on this offer. He went to this temple, Horyuji, and ended up spending about 4 years there. And this abbot Sayaki himself was pretty famous guy in his time. He ended up being the head of the Hoso sect, the Japanese Yogacara sect, 3 separate times. So, despite the fact that Sawaki's engagement with Yogacara was sort of unintentional, he would end up using these ideas in his talks later in life. And so that was what I was interested in. So this is all coming from a paper that I wrote for a class, Indian philosophy, or Indian Buddhist philosophy. So what I sort of want to look at here is how his engagement with Yogacara might sort of lead him to some positions that differ a little bit from sort of Soto orthodoxy, if you could call it that. And one of the ways that this happens, and Hojo-san sort of suggested this to me, is that Zen tends to focus on inherent enlightenment or Buddha nature a lot. That is the idea that sort of underneath everything we're already enlightened, and we just need to sort of brush off the kind of adventitious ignorance that covers over that. This is something that Dogen himself sort of criticizes certain views of. If you just sort of think, oh, I'm already enlightened and I don't need to do anything, Dogen clearly says that's not the case. I think Sawaki sort of, in using Yogacara, takes that a step further and sort of focuses on this East Asian Yogacara idea of almost like inherent ignorance. So it's almost like the opposite of inherent enlightenment. And this comes from the idea of the Storehouse Consciousness that I was talking about before. In Indian Buddhism, the Storehouse Consciousness is seen to be as sort of neutral. So you can have like positive seeds or negative seeds depending on your karma, but the Storehouse Consciousness itself is neither good nor bad. In East Asian Yogacara, this transformed a little bit, and they began to see it more as an inherently negative space because of the negative seeds that it contains. So we see this come up in Sawaki's presentations of Zen. Okay, so just really briefly, I want to point out that Zen in its early origins does have some Yogacara material that's important in the early development of Zen. So his use of Yogacara ideas is not totally foreign to Zen as a school. So in some very early sources, we see this text called the Lanka Sutra as being sort of praised very highly. So Bodhidharma, who's supposed to be the first ancestor of Zen, is said to have given this text, the Lanka Sutra, to his student Hueka, the guy who famously cut off his arm and presented it to Bodhidharma, if you all know the story. And this text, the Lanka Sutra, is sort of a hybrid Yogacara Buddha nature text. So it posits that the Storehouse Consciousness is actually Buddha nature, basically, or Tathagata Garbha, if you want to use the Indian terminology. So it sees, instead of inherently neutral or inherently negative, it's saying that the Storehouse Consciousness is inherently positive, and it's just covered over by these negative seeds. So already there, it's different from what we might call the orthodox Yogacara position, but nonetheless it uses some of the vocabulary of Yogacara. But interestingly, by the time the Platform Sutra is produced, so this is a very important text in Zen that describes this famous poetry competition between Huineng, who's the 6th ancestor, and Shenshu, one of his Dharma brothers. In this text, what's interesting is in the story, Shenshu writes his verse on a wall late at night when everyone's sleeping, and then his teacher wakes up and sees it and says, "Oh, this is a great verse." The wall that he wrote on was supposed to have murals from this text, the Lanka Sutra, written on it. But once he writes the verses on it, he cancels those murals and says, "Oh, we'll just leave this verse here because it's so great." So some scholars sort of see this as an indication of the diminishing importance of this text in the Zen school, And then in addition to that, Huineng, who's really the hero of the story, he is supposed to be enlightened upon hearing the Diamond Sutra, which is representative of this school of thought, or a Prajñapāramita text. So in the Platform Sutra, we sort of see a de-emphasis of Lanka Vitara and the Yogacara material, and sort of a maybe rise in importance of Madhyamaka thought. At least that's one way of reading it, it's according to one particular scholar. Okay, so by the time Soto Zen comes to Japan, Dogen, remember, was originally part of the Tendai school. The Tendai school was founded by a person named Saicho, who had some pretty strong disagreements with the Yogacara school. So there were a lot of sort of public confrontations between Saicho and his Tendai philosophy and the Yogacara school in Japan, which was already pretty prominent by that time. By the time Dogen was a priest, that's like 400 years after Saicho, Tendai had become the dominant school, and the Hoso school had been really sort of diminished in importance. So we find very little use of Yogacara philosophy in Dogen's writing. Last week, Hojo-san mentioned an excerpt from Genjo Koan that does sort of draw from Yogacara philosophy, but that might be like really the only time that he ever uses Yogacara philosophy. So basically the point here is that Yogacara does have some influence on Zen's development, but by the time of Dogen it's pretty diminished and sort of pushed to the background. So any questions on any of that stuff so far? Yeah.
I was just wondering, is the Madhyamika school basically the same tradition as the Prajñapāramita?
Sort of. So my understanding is that the Prajñapāramita texts come, prior to the sort of development of this school. So they start appearing, I think, around like the BC AD changeover. And this school doesn't really sort of get sort of established until like 200 AD. But they're based on those texts. They basically take those texts and form a philosophy from them. In the same way, actually, Yogacara is based on some texts that sort of predate its formation as a school as well. So we see the vocabulary in both cases coming up before the philosophical schools develop. Yeah.
So is Yogacara diminished over all schools of Buddhism, or?
No. Yeah, that's a good question. So in Tibetan Buddhism, for example, Yogacara is really important, both Yogacara and Madhyamaka. So Tibetan Buddhism is seen sort of more as kind of developing directly out of Indian Buddhism. So they sort of take all the major currents and continue them. So yeah, Yogacara never had any sort of huge diminished importance in Tibetan Buddhism, although I think they tend to favor Madhyamaka a little bit more, but both are kind of together. And in later Indian philosophy too, there were sort of hybrid Madhyamaka Yogacara philosophies where they sort of put the two together. So yeah, definitely not overall, but certainly in Japan because of the dominance of the Tendai school. And I think also in China eventually, it sort of lost importance, I think mostly to Zen actually. So, yeah.
I've heard there's another tradition, I think, Sarvastin?
Oh, Sarvastivadin, yeah.
Is that around the same time?
I'm not really sure. I think that's a little earlier. But yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, so let's get into Kōdō Sawaki. How am I doing on time? I don't have any timepiece.
It's 10:34.
Okay. So basically what I did in this paper was I found some quotations from Kōdō Sawaki that looked like they were drawing from Yogacara philosophy, and then I tried to find sort of similar passages in Indian Yogacara texts, and then I did kind of a comparison between them. So I'd like to read this first little bit from Kōdō Sawaki. So he says, "We often confidently say, 'I saw it with my own eyes,' or 'I heard it with my own ears,' but these eyes and ears are questionable. We're all deceived by our eyes, ears, noses, tongues, bodies, and minds. We talk about whether we're happy or unhappy, but these two are only transitory experiences. In reality, there's nothing special. So that's what Sawaki says here. So I think we can already see, some of these elements. He's basically doing the same thing and negating eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. He's saying these are sources of deception for us. And then, even our emotional experiences like happiness or unhappiness are also confused because they're bound up in this sort of illusory world, Yogacara would say, of external objects separate from the self. And then at the end he says, in reality there's nothing special. So this term, there's nothing special, is something that comes up a lot in Zen, and especially Soto Zen. And it is often sort of getting at reality prior to dualistic thinking. So again, in this idea of manifestation only, that would be prior to our dualistic thinking. And it often specifically is sort of referring to Zazen, this idea of nothing special, just sitting, doing nothing special. So I'll come back to how this fits in with Zazen. So next, to compare this passage, I'll read a little bit from a text by Vasubandhu. So he's one of the important philosophers of the Yogacara school. And this is from a text called the Triṃśikā, the 30 verses. And this is a really important text in East Asian Yogacara. It was adopted in a text called the Chung Wei Shi Lun. In Japanese, it's the Jo Yui Shikiron. And this is a text that was produced by Xuanzang. So Xuanzang was a really important Chinese monk who went to India and gathered all these texts, practiced in India for a long time, and then brought them back to China and became a major translator. So this text, the Chung Wei Shi Lun, includes a translation of the Triṃśikā, but also a series of translated commentaries from Indian philosophers about the text. And he did it in such a way that all the commentaries are sort of mixed together, so it becomes its own unique text. It can't really be compared, directly to anything in India. But at any rate, the verses that Vasubandhu wrote go like this. So, on the fundamental consciousness, the 5 consciousnesses originate according to conditioning factors. So these 5 consciousnesses, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind, so forth, are dependent on causes and conditions. I think that's pretty straightforward. Things seem to appear in the world and something appears in our consciousness as a result. Whether altogether or otherwise, as the waves arise upon the water. So just like waves arise upon the water resulting from causes and conditions, so too does it happen with our consciousness. There is coexistence of mental consciousness always, except in non-ideation. The 2 cessations and torpor and fainting, where there is no awareness. So he's saying that the mind consciousness or mental consciousness is always coexistent with these sense consciousnesses, except he's saying, and this is getting at sort of dense Buddhist philosophy, but he's saying there are some exceptions, like if we're in a state of torpor or cessation, or if we're passed out, then we don't have that awareness, but otherwise we always do. So then he says, the transformation of consciousness is imagination. What is imagined by it does not exist. Therefore, everything is representation only, or manifestation only. So what he's saying is, what we imagine to be true, and this gets at the imagined nature that we were talking about last week, if we posit that things really exist out in the world that are separate from us, I'm here, they're out there, that, according to Yogacara philosophy, is an imagination. It's not the way reality really is. And then he says, whatever thing is imagined by whatever imagining is of an imaginary nature and non-existent. So they like to play with words in this way. But this explicitly mentions that imagined nature that we talked about last week. The dependent nature is an imagination arising out of conditioning factors. The absolute is the latter when it is forever separated from the former. So again, this sounds really confusing, but basically what he's saying here is that the dependent nature, which is basically dependent origination, that is like the way that the world functions, or reality sort of as it is, if we can separate our imagined nature from that reality, then that is the absolute. That is true reality there. Once we have dispelled all of our delusions, reality exists just as it is, and that's, you know, what they would say thusness is there instead. So does that make sense?
No, could you repeat that again?
Well, I don't know if it'll help if I read it again, but the dependent nature is an imagination arising out of conditioning factors. So basically we perceive this dependent nature as something imagined. So even though the same process is going on, whether or not we're deluded or enlightened, that is dependent origination, we as normal people perceive it in this imaginary way, where we see ourselves as separate from the objects of our reality. So all it's saying is once we can cut off that imagination, then the dependent nature becomes the absolute. So reality becomes absolute once we remove our imagination, our mistaken ideas from it, essentially. I'll come back to this a little bit, too. Basically, I think that what's going on here is Sawaki's quotation that I read in this phrase here, or these few verses, are basically pretty similar. But Sawaki, of course, is using much more common sense terminology. So he's saying that what we see here, etc., these are all mistaken views. The true reality of nature is just nothing special, referring to reality prior to our dualistic thinking. So he uses this sort of quintessentially Soto Zen phrase of nothing special to sort of, you know, tie these two philosophies together. And I'll come back to how this relates to Zazen at the end. But sort of important to note is how this differs from sort of a standard Soto approach maybe. So in Shobogenzo Makahanya Haramitsu, so this is Dogen's commentary on the Heart Sutra, he writes that the 12 sense fields, so that is these here, the things that are all negated by Yogacara, are 12 instances of prajna paramita. So these themselves are essentially, you know, true wisdom or, you know, enlightenment, one might say. There are 18 instances of prajna, and then he uses eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind, etc., and it lists all of these things. So Dogen is saying that it's not, you know, he's definitely not negating them. He's not saying that they don't exist in the way that Yogacara people would want to do. But he's saying instead, because these are, you know, essentially empty of essences, they can teach us about what emptiness means, and therefore they're a source of enlightenment for us. But the important point for this is that he's clearly not negating them when he says that there are 18 instances of prajna, and these are all of them. So Sawaki then is, in using this Yogacara material, is taking a little bit of a different tact from Dogen, but I'd say, you know, once we get back to how it relates to Zazen, what they're really saying is the same, I think. Okay, so the next passage from Sawaki, he says that according to the demonstration of consciousness only, so this was the text by Xuanzang that I mentioned a minute ago, the Changwei Shilun, it says that when the inner consciousness evolves, it seems to divide into two parts. Even though only one consciousness arises, that is manifestation only, there's only one consciousness, it seems to us that subject, I, and objects, the world, exist separately. Within this structure, we start to chase after objects or flee from them. Then we begin to make a great fuss over nothing. So this is sort of Sawaki's typical kind of way of speaking. So in this case, he's directly quoting from a Yogacara text, and the passage that this comes from is right at the beginning of this text, and it's part of the commentary on so the verses that I just read a second ago, this would be the commentary on the very first verse of that poem, which I didn't read, but so the text, the Changwei Shilun, says, internal consciousness evolves resembling an external realm. So we only have this one manifestation, so our reality as it appears to us is just sort of one unitary thing. But it resembles an external world, so it looks like you all are out there in reality, but it's really just this one consciousness. As a result of the power of impressions from imagining a self and dharmas, when the consciousnesses are born, they change into a self and dharmas. So dharmas in this sense means phenomena, so things happening out in the world. So because we're so used to imagining the self as separate from the stuff out in the world, when the consciousnesses are born, they all change into self and stuff. So we perceive them as an I and a thing perceived. Even though the images of this self and dharmas are within consciousness, still, due to imagination, or the imagined nature, they appear external. From beginningless time, sentient beings consider them to be real selves and real dharmas as a result of this grasping. One is like a dreamer, whose mind, because of the power of the dream, appears in the form of various external things, and who consequently considers them to be really external things. So Yogacara likes to do this a lot. They like to talk about dreams because it's sort of a perfect analogy for what they're trying to prove. When we dream, we see things that seem to be out there in the real world, but in fact, they're not, of course. When we wake up, we think they're not. So Yogacara is basically just saying that the rest of reality is also like that. Yeah, Scott?
Yeah, do you think the Yogacara philosophy is solipsistic?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is sort of one of the potential problems with this philosophy is that so solipsism is kind of the idea that only I exist and nothing else really exists. It's all just sort of fake. So yeah, they don't really mention that explicitly as far as I'm aware. But they don't negate the idea that other people have a consciousness. And how that works, it gets confusing. I'm not sure how you can have multiple consciousnesses sort of perceiving the same thing. But yeah, it definitely seems to be sort of one of the problems. And I'm sure it's addressed somewhere, but not that I'm super aware of. So, but I think they would say it's not a form of solipsism. Okay, so where were we? Yeah, so in this passage that I just read, and the one from Sawaki before that, he says, even though only one consciousness arises, so it seems like he sort of accepts this Yogacara worldview because he's saying that there is in fact only one consciousness that divides into subject and object. So I find that kind of interesting that he seems to maybe accept this idea of Vijñaptimātratā. And then Hojo-san, in commenting on this passage, so this passage appears, the Sawaki passage appears in the Zen teaching of Homeless Kodo. So Hojo-san wrote, his quote in this chapter expresses one of the fundamental points of consciousness only. All we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and think is only consciousness. We don't see objects themselves as they are. Yeah, it seems that he, at least on some level, is accepting this view. So let's see. So now let's get into how this relates to Zazen. So I think that the reason that, so Sawaki, I think his main concern is Zazen. And yes?
Could I make a quick comment
before
we go into that? The last thing that you had read, I think it was a quote of Hojo-san's, some version of we don't see things as they really are.
Right.
Is that accurate? Some version of that? So, not that I understand it, but science says something very similar.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. Modern sort of physics seems to say that the world as it really probably exists is quite different from the way that we perceive it. But they don't necessarily negate it though. They don't say it's not really there, but they just say it's probably very different.
So for your next paper, would you please investigate this and present it to us?
Maybe, yeah. The scholars don't really like, when you talk about science, because it gets sort of anachronistic maybe, but yeah, it would certainly be interesting. And I think too that you can read Yogacara to not really maybe negate the physical world, but just that the only means of our experience is through this manifestation only. So maybe there is a real world out there, but the only thing that we perceive is our consciousness. So although there are times when they seem to pretty directly want to say these things don't exist. So I don't know. All right, so. I think that Sawaki adopted these points because he wanted to explain Zazen, essentially. So the kind of defiling nature of duality is pretty central to the theory of Soto Zen practice. So Zazen is understood, I think, to be sort of the practice of non-duality. When Uchiyama Roshi says we open the hand of thought, that basically means we're practicing non-duality, I think. Likewise, when we just sit, when we practice shikantaza, in just sitting, duality disappears. Likewise, when Dogen says dropping off body and mind, all of these sense organs are sort of ceasing to function in their normal way, and in that sense, we're no longer dual. So insofar as this idea of manifestation only negates duality, I think it's useful for Sawaki Roshi to explain how Zazen works. So one of his pretty distinctive teachings is he says that although we have Buddha nature, we also have what he calls thief nature. So thief nature stands in for any kind of like ego-centered activities, not just referring to stealing specifically. In this text, there's a text called To You, at least that's how it's translated in English. I'm not sure what the Japanese title is. And this is available, it's not published, but it's on the Antaiji website, translated into English. So there's a section, To you who say that your body, just as it is already Buddha. So he writes, so Sawaki Roshi says, Ishigawa Goemon, so Ishigawa Goemon is like the Japanese Robin Hood. He was a thief who stole from rich people and gave to poor people. So Ishigawa Goemon said, even once I have disappeared and all the sand has washed into the sea, the seeds of thievery in the world will never be exhausted. This is how he sings the praises of the thief nature that penetrates heaven and earth. And yet, as long as we don't act like Goemon, we won't become thieves. It's also said that all things have Buddha nature and that it completely penetrates heaven and earth. But as long as we don't act like a Buddha, we don't become Buddhas. When you, inseparable from Buddha, put Buddha's activity into practice, only then are you a Buddha. And when you act like a fool, then you're a fool. It's only in your approach to life that Buddha appears. So, I think we can get back to the three natures now. So, we talked about these a little bit. So last week, Ojo-san talked about them, but I'm just going to erase this. So there is the imagined nature. The dependent nature. And the perfected nature. Lots of different ways to translate these, but so that's how they appear in Sanskrit. It's a little bit different in the Chinese and Japanese version, so one scholar puts these in what he calls the pivotal model. So the dependent nature is the pivot in the pivotal model, and I'll explain what that means. Again, the imagined nature is sort of seeing reality as if objects really are separate from yourself. So that's the imagined nature. The dependent nature is basically dependent origination, so the way the world actually is. And then the perfected nature is sort of seeing the world as it really is, without the imagined nature. So enlightenment then is a pivot from here to here. So that's one way that the Yogacara philosophers thought about enlightenment. And in some other texts, it's perceived a little differently, like you're walking from the imagined nature to the dependent nature to the perfected nature. And he calls that, the scholar calls it the path model, or the progressive model. But I think that this one is maybe going to be more fruitful for looking at Sawaki, and I'll explain why. So I think that Sawaki's thief nature, Buddha nature dichotomy is basically like this imagined and perfected nature here. And in this quote, he's saying that both of them fully penetrate heaven and earth. And heaven and earth is often used I mean, it's a tenchi in Japanese, and it just means sort of like reality or the world as it is. So I think heaven and earth are sort of like the dependent nature. It's just reality as it is. So basically what happens, he's saying that as soon as we act like a fool, then we're a fool. So when we act like a fool, we're living within the imagined nature. But when we sit down and do Zazen, we become a Buddha. We're perfected in that moment of doing Zazen. So this is a little different from what the Indian Yogacara people would want to say, because they would probably want to say that you only get from here to here once, and it's after like countless lifetimes of practice. And once you're enlightened, you're enlightened. But in the Soto Zen world, I think we can pivot back and forth between these two things depending on what we're doing. So that's just what Sawaki was saying. When we act like Buddha, we become Buddha. When we act like a fool, we become a fool. I think it's interesting to look at Sawaki's thief nature, Buddha nature in this context. And as I mentioned, there's also an idea that you go from one to the other. But I don't think that Sawaki would have liked that idea as much, because it's sort of like there's this dichotomy between gradual and sudden awakening in Buddhism. And the path model or progressive model, of course, is very kind of gradual. You go from one thing to the next, where this is a very sudden pivot, as it were, from one thing to the next. Also, practice and enlightenment are one. This is Dogen's famous line. So that is sort of what's behind this idea that we can become a Buddha in the moment of practicing Zazen. And Sawaki about this, he says, imagine someone saying, since I was young, I've been very honest. So lately I've stopped being honest and occasionally steal. We can't hoard credit for our good deeds. Like Ishikawa Goemon, the moment we steal, we enter the thief realm. Like Buddha, when we do Zazen, we immediately enter the Tathagata realm. So in saying that we can't hoard credit, the traditional Buddhist view would be you get lots of merit for practicing over time, and as your merit builds up, you progress along the path, and then finally, after many lifetimes, you get the perfected nature. So here I think Sawaki is sort of explicitly rejecting that. We can't hoard credit. Just because we do something good one day doesn't mean we can take a break the next day. So let's see. So in commenting on Sawaki Roshi's thief nature, Uchiyama Roshi wrote, though we have more or less a criminal's outlook and character, our Buddha's action causes our everlasting redemption. To act, whether as a thief or a Buddha, is to manifest everlasting thief or everlasting Buddha here in this moment. No one can be a thief from head to toe, and no one can be a Buddha from head to toe. So again, I think that Uchiyama Roshi is sort of following Sawaki Roshi in this emphasis of kind of inherent ignorance by saying that our basic state is to have a criminal's outlook, which is a pretty stark thing to say. I think that this is one thing to keep in mind about our lineages. I think in using these points, just ever so slightly, we sort of step outside maybe the Soto orthodoxy in saying that it's not just that we have this inherent Buddha nature, but also we have this criminal's outlook or thief nature as well. But ultimately, I think that it really confirms or supports the Soto Zen picture of how Zazen works. That is that as soon as we sit in sincere Zazen, that is a manifestation of awakening. And likewise, when we don't do that, then we're fools. So I think that that's all that I have. Any questions? Comments? Yeah.
It's not really a question, but when you mentioned there, we can't hoard, how did you say it? We can't hoard?
Yeah, Sawaki Roshi wrote that we can't hoard credit for our good deeds.
Yeah, that reminded me so much of that story of Kōdō Dharma and the emperor.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the no merit.
Mm-hmm.
Story.
Yep, exactly.
So you think in that sense that it's diametrically opposed to Pure Land?
I guess, Pure Land, of course, is not monolithic. And I think that actually, Shinran's view of how Pure Land Buddhism works is sort of similar to this. He says that the moment that we chant the Nembutsu, we're sort of already in the Pure Land. So I think at least in that interpretation, it's quite similar to this. But maybe the sort of more standard view, would be different for sure. Yeah.
I studied Western philosophy in college.
Mm-hmm.
That was a long time. But I think I remember some discussions that were similar to this. And I wonder if you or anyone else remembers anything about that.
Since I teach it, I
Oh,
know.
Yeah,
okay,
please.
well, I think I remember some, it was maybe Bertrand Russell, was it?
No, Russell wouldn't be, I think. Berkeley, Bishop
Berkeley,
Berkeley.
yeah.
Oh,
Barclay
okay.
Benny. He'd be the prime example.
And there was a discussion of a table. I'm looking at a table, and I see that it has certain characteristics, but I forget the real discussion. It doesn't actually exist, or there's an interaction between the object and myself, so that I'm not actually seeing it as it is.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, so
Well,
just
for-
throwing that
Yeah,
out.
please.
For Berkeley, he starts with John Locke's distinction between primary and secondary attributes.
Mm.
So secondary attributes are the way in which I see things through my senses, with the presumption that there is a primary suchness there that's a priori to my seeing.
Okay.
That's like the atomic structure and things like that. So I keep fluctuating to say Barclay and Berkeley because Berkeley, California is named after
Right.
Berkeley.
But
So
British
California mispronounced his name.
Right.
But he says, why should we, sort of Occam's razor, why should we assume that there's an externality there as we never really experience as such? That's a metaphysical postulation for
Okay.
which there's no empirical confirmation that it is so. Therefore, let's just get rid of that idea and say it's all consciousness. Now comes my favorite part here, and Russell quotes this. Berkeley has somebody like doing a poem prayer, praying to God, saying, "Oh God, why is it that even if I'm not perceiving the tree in the courtyard, the tree still perceives to be there? Why is it still there?" To which God replies, "I am always in the courtyard perceiving the tree, and that's why the tree never ceases to be." So he postulates a theology that there's the mind of God that forever sustains the perception of things, so that there is a continuity of externality in appearance, because it's not just my mind, it's also God's mind. Right? So that's how they get around that. Hegel goes off in another direction.
Thank you. And I was going to continue from that.
Okay.
Thank you very much. To asking you if you could talk more about, there was a point there where you talked about thusness.
Oh, yeah.
And this is a term I've heard for a long time, Buddhist term,
Mm-hmm.
or suchness, I think it's also
Yeah.
sometimes translated. And I've never really known what was meant by that, but I think it's very close to what you were discussing here. Do you think that's true? Could you say a little more about it?
Yeah, so I asked the professor that I took this class with about that term, and according to him, it sort of comes up all over the place. So in all different kind of schools of Buddhist discourse, and even we actually looked for it once. You can search the Pali Canon by like typing in a search term, and it appears there as well. At least I think it was like only one instance, but it at least does occur there. But yeah, I mean, this is just an expression for reality as it is, and there are many different ways of saying this, I think. But I think the idea behind it is, when we think of thus, just sort of, it's sort of almost a very succinct way of talking about reality as it is. So that's why it's sort of I think a popular term. And also in Sanskrit, it's ta, which is related to tathagata. So, the tathagata is, thus come or thus gone. So thusness is sort of the expression of what the Buddha sees. So. Mm-hmm.
Alan Watts has fun with that. He says it's like a child going around saying, "Da, da,
Yeah.
da."
Yeah, okay.
And two things. One is thusness. Is it referring to the pivot point of dependent in your diagram there?
So in the pivotal model, I guess you could say it would be either of these. So in the pivotal model, the dependent is sort of like an ontological category. So this is like the only thing that actually exists here. Yeah. And then these are two ways of perceiving that reality. So yeah, you could say that the dependent is thusness, but
Okay.
I kind of more specifically perceiving it from this perfected view is thusness.
Okay. So the second point is, within the Christian tradition, there's a notion that there's behavior and then there's the being that does the behavior, which St. Augustine said, hate the sinner, hate the sin, not the sinner. Love the sinner. And that's making a huge distinction between behavior and the person, which is really different than when I behave like a Buddha, I am a Buddha. When I behave like a thief, I am a thief. So that's one thing. I'm wondering if you have any comment about that distinction. And then there's another place that I'd like to take this kind of thinking, and it goes like this. So if I behave like a Buddha, then I'm like a Buddha. If I behave like a thief, then I'm like a thief. So then who is this who's behaving one way or the other? It seems to postulate that there is a self that either becomes a Buddha or becomes a thief.
Yeah, so, all forms of Buddhism don't negate the idea of sort of a conventional self. So we have this sort of bundle of reality that, persists through some period of time, and, behaves in what sort of grammatically is like, convenient to refer to as a self. But, in the Madhyamaka school, they would say, the self doesn't have an essence, so therefore it's not really like a self in the way that we would normally think of it as having sort of a soul and long continuity and so forth. And in the case of Yogacara, I think this is actually one of the things that they were criticized for, is because the Storehouse Consciousness does look a lot like a self. So the people that didn't like the philosophy, they would sort of attack that idea as perhaps, representing something that violates this idea of no self. And actually one of the reasons that they came up with that idea is because it helps to explain how karma works over multiple lifetimes. So, if you're being reborn, presumably, everything is getting sort of scattered and rearranged. So how does karma continue to act? So the Storehouse Consciousness was sort of a way of explaining this. So these seeds come with you when you reincarnate, basically, and they can ripen in future lives.
Well, I think also that it just beyond, just microcosmos, from moment to moment, how do you explain the continuity of things? So why do I seem to be the same person I was a moment ago, when in fact I'm not, because there's change, impermanence, and process. So the idea of the seed is so that you can have a continuity. So what I am now is not what I was before, but rather the seed of what was before is what I am now.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and the seeds are getting laid down, some of them like super fast, and they're ripening super fast, but others are very slow acting, so something I do now might affect me.
I think the concept was in Abhidharma before it made its way into Mahayana.
Yeah, so so Vasubandhu was one of the most famous Abhidharma philosophers, but he used to be sort of in something like, a non-Mahayana school of Buddhism, and that's when he wrote his Abhidharma stuff, and he converted to Mahayana Buddhism after writing this huge treatise on the Abhidharma. So, some scholars have postulated that maybe there are multiple Vasubandhus to explain how he could have, wrote such a sort of magnificent non-Mahayana treatise and then gone on to do,
Many seeds.
the seeds, exactly. Yes.
So you brought up Storehouse Consciousness, and that I was going to ask you a question about that, which is, what does Zen do with Storehouse Consciousness? Is it just rejected, or?
So I don't think it comes up a whole lot in as a term in normal Zen discourse. But I think to the extent maybe that it's around, it probably is influenced by that text, the Lanka Vitara Sutra, which equates it with Buddha nature, the Tathagata. So it's sort of this inherently pure thing that we have to uncover through our practice, or in Soto terms, something that we manifest in the moment of zazen, or so does that make sense?
It does make sense. It raises another, a question I've had pretty much all along since entering this practice is the question of karma. It doesn't seem to have much relevance, at least what I've been exposed to in Zen.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm, well qualified to give a great answer to the question, but I think that in having this theory of meditation that Soto Zen has, it sort of allows for anyone, I think, to manifest Buddhahood regardless of your sort of past karma. So in that sense, maybe it's not so important, but I think, if you look at, for example, like the Shobogenzo Zuimonki, Dogen talks quite a bit about karma in that text, and we'll say sort of things like, I think basically the general idea is, if you have good karma, that's what's going to allow you to come to this practice in the first place. If you have really lousy karma, you're never going to step into a practice center and be able to do zazen. But I guess also, in sort of the modern form of Japanese Buddhism, I think that karma definitely does become a little bit de-emphasized because it doesn't line up so well with multiple lives, which is the traditional way that karma is conceived. So yeah, I would like to investigate that more myself. But yeah, it's a great question.